Welcome to True Crime Stories for English Learners, where real-life mysteries meet clear and simple English.
The UFO cult's final exit, Heaven's Gate. The anonymous tip came into the San Diego County Sheriff's Department on March 26, 1997. A former member of a group called Heaven's Gate had received a disturbing package, videotapes showing members saying goodbye, talking about leaving their bodies behind, preparing for what they called the next level. The tipster was worried something terrible had happened. Deputies were dispatched to a mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, an affluent suburb of San Diego. When they entered the house at 18241 Colina Norte, they found a scene that would shock the world. 39 bodies lay throughout the house, all arranged neatly on beds or bunk beds. They were covered with purple shrouds, and each had a small overnight bag packed beside them. They all wore identical black shirts, black pants, and brand new Nike sneakers. The members of Heaven's Gate had committed mass suicide, believing they were leaving their earthly vehicles behind to board a spacecraft they believed was trailing the Hale-Bopp comet. They thought this spacecraft would take them to the next level, a higher plane of existence beyond human life. This wasn't a sudden act of violence like Jonestown. This was a carefully planned, methodical group suicide carried out over 3 days. The members died in shifts, with some helping others die before taking the poison themselves. They had prepared videotapes explaining their actions. They had updated their website with farewell messages. They died believing they were graduating to something better. This is the story of Heaven's Gate, how two charismatic leaders created a cult that mixed science fiction with apocalyptic religion, how they convinced intelligent people to give up everything, including their lives, and how 39 people died chasing a spaceship that didn't exist. The founders, Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles. The story of Heaven's Gate begins with two people who met in the early 1970s and formed a partnership that would last until death and beyond. Marshall Herff Applewhite was born in Spur, Texas. His father was a Presbyterian minister, and Marshall grew up in a religious household. He was intelligent and talented, particularly in music. He earned a master's degree in music and became a music professor at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. He was married with 2 children and seemed to have a stable, respectable life. But Marshall was struggling with his sexuality. He was gay or bisexual in an era when this was deeply stigmatized, especially in religious communities. He had affairs with male students, which eventually led to his dismissal from the university. His marriage fell apart. He attempted to cure his sexuality through a short marriage to a nurse, but it didn't work. By the early 1970s, Marshall was divorced, estranged from his children, and searching for meaning and purpose. In 1972, Marshall checked himself into a psychiatric hospital, reportedly to deal with his sexuality and depression. There, he met Bonnie Lou Nettles, a nurse who worked at the hospital. Bonnie was married with 4 children, but she was also searching for something more. She was deeply interested in spirituality, astrology, and the occult. She attended seances and believed she could channel spiritual entities. Marshall and Bonnie formed an immediate and intense connection. They believed they had known each other in past lives. Bonnie told Marshall that they were meant for a special purpose, that they were the 2 witnesses mentioned in the book of Revelation in the Bible, prophets who would be martyred and then ascend to heaven. This grandiose shared delusion became the foundation of their movement. In 1973, Marshall and Bonnie left their families and began traveling together. They adopted new names. Marshall became Bo, and Bonnie became T. Later, they would use other names, with Marshall eventually settling on Do, pronounced like the musical note, and T, also a musical note. They referred to themselves as the Two and began recruiting followers. Their message was bizarre but compelling to certain people. They claimed to be extraterrestrial beings in human bodies. They said they had come to Earth to help humans evolve to the next level of existence. They promised that UFOs would come to collect them and their followers, taking them to a higher plane of existence beyond the physical world. Building the cult. In 1975, the two held a meeting in Waldport, Oregon, where they attracted their first significant group of followers, about 20 people. Their message appealed to people who were spiritual seekers, interested in UFOs and science fiction, and dissatisfied with conventional religion. The 1970s was a time of spiritual experimentation in America, and many people were open to unconventional beliefs. The two's teachings were a strange mix of Christianity, New Age spirituality, and science fiction. They claimed that Earth was a garden being tended by higher beings. Humans were like plants that could either grow to the next level or remain stuck at the human level. The two said they were gardeners sent to harvest those who were ready to evolve. To evolve, followers had to give up everything human: possessions, relationships, sexuality, individuality. The group called this overcoming the human kingdom. Members had to sever ties with family and friends. They gave away or abandoned their possessions. They adopted new names. They dressed identically. They were not allowed to have romantic or sexual relationships. The group lived nomadically for years, moving from place to place, camping, staying in cheap motels. They survived on money from new recruits and occasional work. They kept a low profile, avoiding media attention. The two maintained absolute control over every aspect of members' lives: what they ate, wore, how they spent their time, even their thoughts. In 1985, Bonnie Nettles died of liver cancer. This was a crisis for the group. The two had promised they would be martyred together and then ascend to heaven in a UFO. Bonnie's death from natural causes didn't fit the prophecy. But Marshall reframed it. Bonnie hadn't really died, he said. She had graduated to the next level ahead of him and was now helping from the other side. He claimed he could still communicate with her. After Bonnie's death, Marshall became the sole leader. The group, which had been calling itself various names over the years, eventually settled on Heaven's Gate. They became more structured and more isolated. In the 1990s, they settled in California and began a business creating websites for companies. This gave them income and allowed them to rent houses where they could live together. Life in Heaven's Gate was highly regimented and austere. Members followed strict schedules and rules designed to eliminate anything human from their lives. They woke at the same time every day and followed a precise schedule of work, study, exercise, and assigned tasks. They ate the same bland food, simple vegetarian meals designed to minimize pleasure. The idea was to overcome attachment to physical sensations. Sex was strictly forbidden. Most members practiced celibacy relatively easily because the cult attracted many people who were already uncomfortable with sexuality, but some members struggled with sexual desires. To solve this problem, Marshall encouraged some male members, including himself, to undergo voluntary castration. At least 8 members, including Marshall, were castrated in the 1990s. They believed this would help them overcome human desires and prepare for their sexless existence in the next level. Members all dressed identically in loose, unisex clothing. Men and women had similar short haircuts. The goal was to eliminate gender and individuality. They even tried to minimize individual personality traits, attempting to become more uniform and less human. They studied Marshall's teachings intensively. He recorded hours of video lectures explaining the group's beliefs and what members needed to do to graduate to the next level. These videos are still available online and show Marshall's charismatic but strange teaching style. He spoke in a distinctive, breathy voice and seemed absolutely convinced of his extraordinary claims. The group was largely isolated from the outside world. Contact with family was discouraged or forbidden. Members could work on websites for outside clients, but had minimal interaction with those clients. They watched television and movies occasionally, but were selective about content, avoiding anything too human or sexual. Despite the extreme nature of the group, most members stayed voluntarily. They weren't physically imprisoned. Some members left over the years, but many stayed for decades. Why? Because they genuinely believed. They believed Marshall was an extraterrestrial being. They believed a spacecraft would come for them. They believed they were preparing for something better than human existence. The approach of Hale-Bopp. In 1995, two amateur astronomers discovered a new comet. It was named Hale-Bopp after its discoverers, and astronomers predicted it would become very bright and visible to the naked eye in early 1997. Comets had always fascinated people, and Hale-Bopp generated significant public interest. For Marshall Applewhite and Heaven's Gate, the approaching comet seemed like a sign. Marshall taught that the next level would send a spacecraft to collect them when the time was right. He began to believe that this spacecraft was traveling behind or with the Hale-Bopp comet. This belief was reinforced by a rumor circulating in UFO communities. An amateur astronomer named Chuck Schremick claimed to have photographed an unusual object near the comet, something he thought might be a Saturn-sized object or spacecraft following the comet. Astronomers quickly debunked this claim, showing that Schremick had simply mistaken a star for an unusual object due to his camera settings. But the rumor spread widely, especially on the early internet. Marshall seized on this rumor as confirmation of his beliefs. He told his followers that a spacecraft was indeed following Hale-Bopp, and this was their sign. The time had come to leave their earthly bodies and join the spacecraft. They would graduate to the next level. He called this process exiting their earthly vehicles. The group didn't think of suicide as death, but as graduation, leaving behind the human body to continue existing at a higher level. Marshall promised they would receive new, more advanced bodies on the spacecraft. The members of Heaven's Gate prepared methodically. They updated their website with farewell messages. They recorded videotapes explaining their decision. They ate at restaurants they enjoyed one last time. They went to the movies. They seemed calm and even happy, believing they were about to achieve what they had been working toward for decades. The exit. In March 1997, the Hale-Bopp comet reached its brightest point in the night sky. It was visible to millions of people around the world, a spectacular sight. For the members of Heaven's Gate, it was the signal they had been waiting for. The group prepared their exit carefully. They rented a large mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, an expensive neighborhood in San Diego County. The house had enough bedrooms for all 39 members. They chose this location specifically for their final act. The method they chose was phenobarbital, a powerful sedative mixed with applesauce or pudding, washed down with vodka. They also placed plastic bags over their heads to ensure death. The combination was designed to be relatively peaceful. The drugs would cause unconsciousness and then death. The group died in 3 waves over 3 days, from March 24th to March 26th. The first group of 15 people took the poison and died, while the others helped them. Then a second group of 15 died, while the remaining members cleaned up and arranged the bodies. Finally, the last 9 members died, with the final 2 members arranging the others before taking the poison themselves. Each body was carefully prepared. They were dressed in identical black shirts, black pants, and brand new black Nike Decades sneakers. They were covered with purple shrouds. Purple was significant to the group, representing royalty and completion. They were laid out neatly on beds or bunk beds throughout the house. Each person had a small overnight bag packed beside them containing clothes, lip balm, and a $5 bill and 3 quarters, money they apparently believed they would need in the afterlife. The members who died later took time to clean the house between waves of deaths. They wanted to make things neat and orderly. They were meticulous in their final actions, treating their suicide as a sacred ritual rather than a desperate act. Before they died, the members recorded farewell videos. In these videos, they explained their decision, expressed excitement about graduating to the next level, and said goodbye to anyone who might be watching. The videos are eerie to watch. The members seem calm, happy even, discussing their upcoming deaths as if talking about a graduation ceremony or a vacation. The Discovery. On March 26, 1997, Rio D'Angelo, a former Heaven's Gate member who had left the group 2 weeks earlier, received a package from the group. It contained the farewell videotapes and instructions for notifying authorities. Rio was troubled by what he saw on the tapes and called the police. When deputies entered the mansion, they found 39 bodies. The scene was orderly but disturbing. Row after row of bodies, all arranged the same way, all dressed identically. It was immediately clear this was a mass suicide, not a murder scene. The members had died voluntarily, believing they were leaving for something better. The identities of the deceased were soon established. They ranged in age from 26 to 72. Most were in their 40s or 50s. The group included 21 women and 18 men. Many had been with Heaven's Gate for over 20 years. These were not crazy or stupid people. They included former computer programmers, nurses, and educated professionals. They were people who had been gradually indoctrinated over years or decades. Marshall Applewhite, age 65, was among the dead. He was in the third and final group. He had led his followers to their deaths and then followed them. The leader who had promised a spacecraft would take them to the next level had died the same way as his followers, poisoned in a rented mansion, leaving behind only corpses and unanswered questions. The investigation and aftermath shocked America and the world. It was the largest mass suicide on U.S. soil and came just 2 years after the Oklahoma City bombing. The 1990s were becoming a decade of disturbing cults and domestic terrorism. Investigators quickly determined that this was indeed a mass suicide, not a murder. The evidence was clear: the videotapes, the careful planning, the orderly scene. The members had killed themselves voluntarily. But why? How could intelligent adults be convinced to kill themselves for a belief in a spaceship that didn't exist? The media descended on the story immediately. The identical Nike sneakers, the purple shrouds, the connection to the Hale-Bopp comet, all of it was reported extensively. The Heaven's Gate website was still online, and millions of people visited it in the days after the suicide. The site contained the group's beliefs, their farewell messages, and their final statements. The families of the deceased were devastated. Many hadn't seen their loved ones in years, as the cult discouraged contact with family. Now they learned their family members had killed themselves in a mass suicide. Some families had tried to get their relatives to leave Heaven's Gate, but had failed. The guilt and grief were overwhelming. The website designers and landlords who had done business with Heaven's Gate were shocked. They had thought the group was just eccentric, not dangerous. The members had been polite, paid their bills on time, and seemed harmless. No one had suspected they were planning mass suicide. Former members who had left the group years earlier struggled with survivor's guilt. Why had they left when others stayed? Could they have done something to prevent this? Some former members spoke to the media, trying to explain how the group operated and why people stayed. Others wanted nothing to do with the publicity. The Nike company was uncomfortable with the attention. The Heaven's Gate members had all worn Nike sneakers, and images of the bodies in their Nikes were broadcast worldwide. Nike issued a statement saying they didn't endorse or approve of how their shoes had been used. Understanding Heaven's Gate. How did Heaven's Gate happen? How did Marshall Applewhite convince 38 people to kill themselves? Understanding this requires looking at several factors. First, the beliefs were built gradually over decades. Marshall didn't immediately tell people to kill themselves. He started with ideas that seemed less extreme: belief in UFOs, spiritual evolution, leaving behind materialism. Over time, the beliefs became more extreme, but members were already committed and couldn't easily recognize how far they had gone. Second, the group provided something many members desperately wanted: community, purpose, and answers to life's big questions. Many members had been spiritual seekers who felt alienated from conventional religion and society. Heaven's Gate gave them a sense of belonging and a clear mission. Third, Marshall was charismatic and convincing. He truly believed his own teachings, which made him more persuasive. He wasn't cynically manipulating people for money or power. He genuinely thought he was an extraterrestrial being preparing humans for the next level. This authentic belief was compelling. Fourth, the group isolated members from outside influences. By cutting contact with family, living communally, and consuming only approved information, members existed in a bubble where Heaven's Gate's beliefs were constantly reinforced and never challenged. Fifth, the group attracted people with certain psychological characteristics. Many members were uncomfortable with human existence, with sexuality, with materialism, with the messiness of human relationships. Heaven's Gate offered an escape from all of that. The promise of becoming something beyond human, something pure and spiritual, appealed to people who had always felt out of place in the human world. Finally, the timing mattered. The Hale-Bopp comet provided a concrete event that Marshall could point to as the long-awaited sign. Without the comet, the group might have continued indefinitely without committing suicide. But the comet created a sense of urgency and opportunity. Finally, the group had normalized the idea of death as graduation over many years. They didn't think they were dying. They thought they were transitioning to a better form of existence. This reframing of death made the final act seem less frightening and more like a positive step. The survivors. Not all Heaven's Gate members died in 1997. A few had left the group shortly before the suicide. They struggled with complex emotions afterward: relief at having survived, guilt about friends who died, and anger at Marshall for leading people to their deaths. Rio D'Angelo, who received the farewell package and alerted police, spoke to the media extensively. He explained that he had left the group just 2 weeks before the suicide and had no idea it was being planned. He struggled with guilt, wondering if he could have prevented it if he had stayed, or if he had contacted authorities earlier. 2 members, Chuck Humphrey and RKY, who used only this single name, had been asked to stay behind to maintain the Heaven's Gate website and spread the group's message after the others graduated. They did this for a while, keeping the site online and responding to inquiries. But both eventually moved on with their lives, though they maintained some belief in the group's teachings. Former members who had left years earlier also grappled with the tragedy. Some felt they had escaped a terrible fate. Others felt sadness for friends who had died. Most struggled to explain to others how they had ever been part of such a group. The stigma of being a former cult member was significant. The families of the deceased faced their own challenges. Some were angry at Marshall for leading their loved ones to death. Others blamed themselves for not trying harder to get their family members to leave. Some tried to understand what their loved ones had believed and why they had made the choice to die. There were no easy answers. The legacy. The Heaven's Gate mass suicide had several lasting impacts on American culture and how we think about cults. First, it highlighted the dangers of internet-era cults. Heaven's Gate was one of the first cults to use the internet extensively for recruitment and communication. Their website remained online for years after the suicide, spreading their message to new audiences. This raised concerns about how the internet could be used to spread dangerous ideologies. Second, the case showed that cult members aren't necessarily uneducated or unintelligent. Many Heaven's Gate members had college degrees and professional careers before joining. They were computer programmers, nurses, and skilled workers. The stereotype of cult members as uneducated or weak-minded was challenged by this case. Third, the mass suicide demonstrated that cults could still be dangerous even in modern America. In the wake of Jonestown in 1978, many people thought such tragedies were behind us. Heaven's Gate proved otherwise. Charismatic leaders could still convince people to die for beliefs that seemed obviously false to outsiders. Fourth, the case raised questions about when, if ever, authorities should intervene in groups with extreme beliefs. Heaven's Gate members were adults who joined voluntarily. They weren't committing crimes until they killed themselves. Should authorities have done something earlier? Could they have done anything? The balance between religious freedom and protecting people from dangerous groups remains difficult. The Heaven's Gate website remained online for many years after the suicide, maintained by the surviving members and then by others. It became a kind of digital memorial and historical record. Eventually, it was taken down, but archives remain. The farewell videos are available online, allowing anyone to watch the members explain their decision in their own words. The Heaven's Gate case has been featured in numerous documentaries, books, and articles. It remains one of the most studied cult cases because of the extensive documentation the group left behind. Unlike many cults that tried to hide their beliefs and practices, Heaven's Gate put everything online, providing researchers with unprecedented access to cult ideology and member testimonials. Lessons from Heaven's Gate. What can we learn from the Heaven's Gate tragedy? First, gradual indoctrination is powerful. No one joins a cult planning to kill themselves. The beliefs become more extreme slowly over time, and members don't notice how far they've gone. By the time suicide is presented as an option, members have been conditioned to accept it. Second, isolation is a key tool of cult control. By separating members from family and outside information, cults create an echo chamber where extreme beliefs seem normal. Maintaining connections outside the group is crucial for reality checking and perspective. Third, charismatic leaders can be dangerous even when they genuinely believe their own teachings. Marshall Applewhite wasn't cynically manipulating people for money or power. He truly believed he was an alien preparing humans for the next level. This sincere belief made him more convincing and ultimately more dangerous. Fourth, the human need for meaning and purpose can be exploited. Many Heaven's Gate members were intelligent people searching for answers to life's big questions. They wanted to believe there was something more than ordinary human existence. This desire for transcendence and meaning is normal and healthy, but it can be twisted by those who offer easy answers to complex questions. Fifth, warning signs should be taken seriously. When a group demands members cut contact with family, when it requires total obedience to a leader, when it promotes us versus them thinking, when it promises access to secret knowledge or special salvation, these are red flags. Friends and family members who notice these signs should try to maintain contact and gently challenge the group's beliefs. Finally, cult members are victims, not fools. The 39 people who died at Heaven's Gate weren't stupid or crazy. They were people who got caught up in a system of belief that gradually became more extreme. They deserve compassion and understanding, not mockery or blame. Remembering the victims. The 39 people who died at Heaven's Gate were more than just cult members. They were individuals with histories, relationships, and potential that was cut short by their involvement in a dangerous group. They included Thomas Nichols, 59, brother of actress Nichelle Nichols, who played Uhura on Star Trek. Thomas had been with the group since the 1970s. Margaret Bull, 49, a former nurse. David Van Sinderen, 48, who had worked as a computer programmer. Gail Mader, 27, the youngest victim. And many others who had once been loved family members, friends, and colleagues. Each of these people had once had dreams and goals that didn't involve dying in a mass suicide. They had been someone's child, sibling, friend. Somewhere along the way, they became convinced that the best thing they could do was leave their earthly bodies to join a spacecraft that didn't exist. Their families and friends were left to mourn and to wonder what they could have done differently. Many struggled with guilt, anger, and confusion. How do you grieve someone who chose to die for beliefs you find incomprehensible? These 39 people deserve to be remembered as victims of manipulation and indoctrination, not as willing participants in their own deaths. They were caught in a system that gradually eroded their ability to think critically and eventually convinced them that suicide was graduation. Marshall Applewhite's responsibility. Marshall Applewhite died alongside his followers, which some might see as honorable. At least he didn't send others to their deaths while remaining alive himself. But this doesn't absolve him of responsibility. Marshall created the beliefs that led to the deaths. He was the leader who convinced people to give up their families, their individuality, and ultimately, their lives. Was Marshall mentally ill? Almost certainly. His beliefs were delusional. He thought he was an extraterrestrial being, that UFOs would collect him, that he could reach a higher plane of existence. These beliefs don't align with reality. But mental illness doesn't eliminate responsibility. Marshall made choices. He chose to recruit followers. He chose to isolate them from outside influences. He chose to teach increasingly extreme beliefs. And he chose to lead them to suicide. Some argue Marshall was as much a victim of his delusions as his followers were victims of his teachings. There's some truth to this. Marshall genuinely believed what he taught. He died believing he was about to board a spacecraft. In his mind, he was helping people, not harming them. But believing you're helping people while actually killing them doesn't make you innocent. Marshall's sincerity doesn't change the fact that 38 people died because they believed what he taught them. He was responsible for creating and leading Heaven's Gate. The tragedy that resulted was ultimately his doing. Final thoughts. The Heaven's Gate mass suicide remains one of the most disturbing cult tragedies in American history. 39 people killed themselves in a carefully planned group suicide, believing they would board a spacecraft and ascend to a higher level of existence. The spacecraft didn't exist. They simply died, leaving behind bodies in identical Nike sneakers and grieving families searching for answers. The tragedy demonstrates how powerful belief can be and how dangerous charismatic leadership becomes when combined with isolation and gradual indoctrination. The members of Heaven's Gate weren't stupid or crazy when they joined. They were people searching for meaning, purpose, and transcendence. Marshall Applewhite offered them these things, but the price was their autonomy, their relationships with family, and ultimately, their lives. The case also shows the limits of intervention. Heaven's Gate operated legally for decades. Members were adults who joined voluntarily. They weren't hurting anyone else. Authorities had no grounds to intervene until it was too late. This raises difficult questions about balancing religious freedom with protecting vulnerable people from dangerous groups. The mansion in Rancho Santa Fe where the suicides occurred was later sold. New owners have lived there, though the property's history makes it notorious. The Nike sneakers became a dark cultural reference, a symbol of the tragedy. The Heaven's Gate website became a digital memorial to beliefs that led to death. Most importantly, we should remember that 39 people died believing in something that wasn't true. They died thinking they were graduating to something better when in reality they were simply ending their lives. They died believing in a teacher who was himself deluded, and they died leaving behind families and friends who will never fully understand how or why they made the choice to leave. The Hale-Bopp comet that supposedly carried the spacecraft has long since passed. The mansion where the bodies were found has been cleaned and occupied by new residents. Marshall Applewhite and his teachings are mostly forgotten except for those who study cults. But the lesson remains. Belief is powerful. Charismatic leaders are dangerous, and isolation from reality can lead to tragedy. Heaven's Gate promised a doorway to the next level. Instead, it was a doorway to death. 39 people walked through that doorway on a spring weekend in 1997, wearing brand new sneakers, believing they were going somewhere wonderful. They were wrong, and now they're gone. Another reminder of how faith without critical thinking, community without healthy boundaries, and transcendence promised by charismatic leaders can end in tragedy.
Another dark chapter closed, but the mystery of human nature continues. Thanks for listening to True Crime Stories for English Learners. Don't forget to subscribe and join me next time for another real story that's stranger than fiction.